All right, so here we are, learning objective 8, the Fed and the money supply. So understand a little bit more about what the Fed is trying to achieve or how they think about changing their interest rate. So we'll kind of walk forward in the next chapter. We think about changes in the macroeconomy and how the Fed responds to those things. But to get a rough idea, in particular with respect to inflation, remember the quantity theory of money tells me that the inflation rate in the long run is the difference between the growth rate and the money supply growth rate, how fast it's growing, minus the growth rate of real GDP. So if the quantity of money is increasing faster than what the increase in output is suggesting it should increase by, we'll get inflation. Prices have to go up as a result. So you can think back to this version of it. When real GDP goes up, if the money supply goes up too fast, faster than Q dictates, since velocity is roughly constant in the long run, prices have to go up to offset, and we get inflation. So given the dual mandate, the Fed wants low inflation, they also have to keep an eye on the money supply. Now, one thing that's somewhat misunderstood is that people sort of assume that the Federal Reserve controls the money supply. And in some sense, the answer is yes, but really they don't. So remember, what they do control is reserves. And reserves are not part of our definition of M2. So M2 is cash or currency in circulation and deposits. And deposits are definitely not reserves. That's what we've determined with our fractional reserve banking system. And so the Fed can't really control directly how many deposits we have in the banking system. They can control cash, but that's a very small part of the total money supply. And so, this is M2 is roughly 15 trillion. Cash accounts for roughly 3 or 4 trillion of that. So only about a third. So, but the Fed does have a big influence on it by controlling the amount of reserves. So let me just kind of give you an example of how the Fed may want to do something or where it may become concerned about the money supply. So when a bank makes a loan, so let's say the bank makes a loan, a new mortgage for $200,000 for somebody to buy a house. That immediately creates $200,000 worth of deposits, or M2, in the economy. Right? There's nothing the Fed can do to control that. The bank is making loans. That increases the supply of money by the same amount. And so if the economy, for example, is doing really well and banks are creating lots and lots of new loans, that's going to tend to increase the money supply. Now, if that starts happening enough, the Fed is going to say, well, our job is to control inflation, or that's one of our jobs. And we see M2 growing faster than what we think it should, according to the quantity theory of money. And so we may need to try to reduce the supply of money. And so the way the Fed can reduce the supply of money, so in this case, the money supply is potentially growing too fast. Let's just assume it is. The Fed thinks it is. And so what am I going to do then to counteract this? Is I need to slow down the growth of the money supply. And the Fed can do that by increasing its target for the federal funds rate. And the way that they effectively do that is to pull reserves out of the system, which reduces banks' ability to make additional loans. So banks need to have the required reserves, and they can only make extra loans if they have more reserves than what they need to cover all of the transactions demand and meet the required reserve ratio or required reserve requirement. So if the Fed pulls out reserves from banks by decreasing the supply of reserves, that's going to make it harder for banks to make loans and is going to slow down the increases in the money supply. So what the Fed is going to do in the federal funds market. So here's RF. So let's stick with my example from before, where the target rate was 2.5%. The Fed thinks, well, the economy is doing a little bit too well in the sense that banks are making a lot of loans, and that might lead to inflation, a growth in the money supply. And so the Fed is going to, let's say, increase its target rate to 3%. Well, how do I get there? Well, its main tool is open market operations, which is to decrease the supply of reserves. And so that doesn't directly impact the money supply at all. Reserves are not part of M2. But it does restrict the flexibility banks have to issue new loans, which is going to tend to then slow down the increases in deposits that are being created as a result of these loans. So decrease the supply of reserves. Banks can't make as many loans. And so the growth in the money supply is going to slow down or decrease. And so that is one way in which the Federal Reserve is going to try to influence what's going on in the economy, is by trying to monitor the growth in the money supply and keeping it in a range they feel will lead to a reasonable amount of inflation, typically in the 2% range. And so if we were going in the other way, the Fed might decrease its target interest rate. And we'll think a little bit about how that works here in the next learning objective.